Okay. Yeah, you never get to know until the chapter 11. It it was several of the shirts.
On page 278 of your text, the author begins an exploration of studies on the outcomes of groups for adults. The pages that follow provide some helpful information regarding the research that has been done on the effectiveness of some specific groups, with attention to college students and adults in midlife. Let's take a moment to talk about group work with college students. Working with college students in the group context has been shown to be quite effective. Many college students struggle with similar issues related to fear of failure, mild depression, anxiety, self-esteem, body image, and interpersonal relationships. Research indicates that the most effective groups for college students are closed format groups that run 10 to 12 sessions. Psychoeducational groups for college students can address issues like self-esteem, public speaking, depression management, stress management, disordered eating, and academic support. Additionally, psychoeducational groups can be helpful for college students who are outside the traditional age range and can offer information and resources for their academic, social, and emotional needs. Additional examples of groups found on the college campus may include those for students who are survivors of sexual assault, students experiencing homesickness, suffering grief or loss, or are exploring issues of sexual orientation. With respect to adults in midlife, your text explores a variety of groups, including those for adult children of alcoholics, victims of abuse, and survivors of suicide, groups specifically for men and for women, groups for couples, families, and people who are divorced, widowed, and remarried. You can refer to your text for more information, but regardless of differences in the specifics, all of these groups require attention to the issue of membership, structure, goals, and evaluation that we've been exploring in the past weeks. The strengths and limitations for working with adults should be familiar to you from previous readings and lectures. Some of the strengths include the cost effectiveness of having one or two group leaders working with people during a single time frame, and other strengths are related to the opportunity for members to change unwanted behaviors and learn new information and skills in a supportive environment. One limitation in group work with adults is scheduling. For children and for adolescents, the school setting is conducive to coordinating member availability and for providing a convenient location for members to meet. For adults, however, it can be challenging to find a time and a place that works for all the members. For adults may be more hesitant to participate in groups, may have preconceptions or reservations related to group treatment, and finally, adults are more likely to have created behavioral patterns that can be difficult to change, and it may take longer for them to learn new ways. As we move now to look at our final population, older adults, we actually enter our largest span, ranging from mid-60s all the way to 120 years of age. Older adults have not always received the attention that they deserve, and it's worth noting that this is a population that's growing. Mental health services are also growing to meet the needs of the population, but myths and stereotypes still threaten the services that older adults receive. Ageism, which is discrimination against older people, can lead to an attitude bias against working with older adults, despite the fact that older adults are often excellent candidates for service, especially group work. And psychoeducational groups may have great benefits for older adults who can experience problems associated with limited socialization and interpersonal activities, and can provide an opportunity for connection. Organizations like the AARP and the Great Panthers provide groups that focus on issues dealing with universal health care, jobs with a living wage, and affordable housing. The groups can provide both meaning and service for older adults. Another example of psychoeducational groups for older adults exists for those who are not as physically able and require long-term care. Long-term care facilities may offer groups that are kept to about 8 to 12 members of similar cognitive ability and provide social and cognitive stimulation that can help members maintain a higher state of functioning than if they were without these services. Your authors also address 7 groups of counseling and psychotherapy groups for older adults. You can refer to page 3 to review these groups. Even if you do not intend to work directly with older adults in the future, becoming familiar with these different groups can enable you to provide helpful resources for your clients as they age, or for family members who might benefit from the services. As we think about setting up groups for older adults, you'll notice that with careful thought and consideration, a few important adjustments can increase the effectiveness of working with this population. All groups, the purpose of the group must be clear so that members can make an informed decision regarding participation. For older adults, group leaders should make clear the goals for the group and how members might benefit from participation. Membership criteria and screening procedures must also be clear so that leaders and members are intentional in how the group is formed. The physical environment is also worth mentioning when considering older adults. In all group work, meeting should be functional, quiet, and geared towards comfort. With older adults, an ideal location may be on the ground floor and is equipped with upholstered chairs, good lighting, space for wheelchairs, and near a restroom. You may also consider hearing impairment and adjust by keeping the group in a small circle. Scheduling is also important with older adults. Early evening and nights might be difficult for members who don't drive during these hours and prefer to go to bed early. By learning about member schedules, a convenient meeting time can be established and then maintained in order to maximize attendance. A final consideration relates to physical ability. Older adults may be more likely to experience physical disability or sensory impairment, both of which can contribute to social isolation. Including a warm-up activity or some kind of brief informational presentation before the group can help members get comfortable and become familiar with the group's focus for the day. Generally, groups for older adults tend to be smaller in size, about 4 to 8 members, and are encouraged to socialize outside of the group context as a way to help break down social barriers that may serve to isolate them. A few quick words about the role of the leader when working with older adults. Leaders must realize that the pace when working with this population may be a bit slower, and the goals may be more limited than for most other groups. Group leaders must maintain an accepting, patient, and positive attitude, reinforcing change and encouraging participation. On the age and health of members, long-term goals may not be appropriate, and instead leaders can encourage members to develop and strive towards short-term goals and objectives. Leaders can rely on all of the skills that we've previously discussed and may be well served to attend to certain key issues like religion, economics, intergenerational conflict within families, and loss, all of which are common themes with older age groups. Remaining sensitive to issues of aging and death, leaders must come to terms with their own aging and eventual death as a way to enable them to engage in meaningful discussions. As with anything, we as counselors cannot expect clients to explore difficult issues if we ourselves are not willing to do the work as well. The body of research on groups with older adults is growing, and there does seem to be evidence that group work is effective with this population. In terms of strengths and weaknesses, older adults can greatly benefit from participation in the group context. For one thing, older adults can improve both the quality and the quantity of their interpersonal relationships, developing and deepening connections with others, which can promote a sense of community and a feeling of belonging. Groups can also offer older adults an opportunity to try new behaviors, gain new knowledge, and enhance self-concept. On the other hand, groups can force members to face issues of loss, and although it's true in all groups with older adults may experience the loss of a member either during or shortly after a group. As I mentioned earlier, groups with older adults are often limited to addressing short-term goals. As we wrap up our lecture on adults and older adults, let's review a few important points. Adulthood between early 20s and mid-60s is a time characterized by many problems and possibilities, and group work with individuals in all stages of adulthood to clarify their focus and maximize their potential. Group work with older adults is still a relatively young field and is increasing in response to a more full understanding of this growing population. Setting up a group for older adults depends on the member's needs, and some minor adjustments can promote a more comfortable and effective experience for the members. Finally, as with many issues, group leaders must consider their own prejudices related to age, aging, and death in order to best serve our clients. Irving Yalom, who is the author of The Schopenhauer Cure, has written extensively, and I would recommend another one of his titles, The Gift of Therapy, which provides a lot of great information for beginning therapists, and specifically a good deal of wisdom related to death and dying. I encourage you to look it up. This concludes our lecture on groups for adults and older adults. Listening.
All right, so that is chapter 11. Just kind of specialized groups. You don't get as many of those with them. Be sure we get some of the closure with groups. So those of you leading the group, it's sometimes hard to just get that first one out of the way. And for good reason, just like knowing what to do and how to do it. It can be a bit stressful. And a lot of us, our first job out of college or in social work is group counseling with kids. And so
This is why she
we'll
wasn't
see that more frequently than not. So that's why I did want to start with this one. And
sometimes missing the light means catching a breather.
If you're a health expert making less than $200,000 a year, then I want to share with you a quote from Warren Buffett that changed everything for me.
So here's the group counseling with kids, because this is a lot of our first jobs. And then
All right, so we're gonna get started, and we're gonna talk today a little bit about providing therapy for children, adolescents, and how to apply this to the school system. Vast majority of it will be related to K to 12, but I did have a slide on the counseling center. So we're gonna talk about children, adolescents, and the school process. So this will be one of our special populations talks, right? So without further ado, let me share my screen, if it'll let me. All right, so our first learning objective is to describe the various types of groups and considerations that affect running groups or conducting groups in school settings. We'll discuss things like recruiting, screening, selecting participants. We'll talk about various guidelines and best practices when running groups with children and adolescents. We'll talk a little bit about the various therapeutic factors linked to play therapy and how it's applied to children and adolescents. We'll talk about developmental themes in adolescence. Most of it will be grounded in Ericksonian work and the concept of the identity crisis and how that affects teenagers. Then we'll discuss the various challenges you might experience when running groups with adolescents, guidelines for helping adolescents deal with anger and conflict, which is fairly common in adolescence. We'll talk briefly about structure of groups in counseling centers and schools. So this lecture provides a general format. It can be applied in many different ways. The first two are very concrete and clear cut. So discussing how to apply groups to children and adolescents, that's pretty clear cut. The application to counseling centers and university centers, that's fairly clear cut, it'll be covered. But these principles can be applied to private practices or community mental health centers, whether they be public or private. So, in general, when we run a group, we put an emphasis on prevention and intervention. When we talk about prevention, what we're really talking about here is primary prevention. And if you've taken a psychopathology course, you've probably heard of primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. Well, primary prevention is to address an issue before it occurs. It's an issue that you can anticipate, and you address it before it becomes a problem. Whereas secondary and tertiary prevention are more or less intervention strategies once the problem has emerged. So the intervention, an intervention can happen in an early stage of development. So you can address drugs and alcohol in a group setting before kids are using drugs, or when they first start using drugs, or after they've developed a substance use disorder and it's interfered with their life. So tertiary prevention is after it's become a significant problem. Now, when we run groups, we want to target before it occurs or along that pathway, early stages or later stage, in a way to promote student development, healthy functioning, and help them navigate their activities of daily living. What we find is that smaller groups are incredibly important when working in school settings. And I know I've talked to you about 8 to 12 being the range of acceptability for groups, but when it comes to school, especially in early childhood, middle childhood, and adolescence, you might consider 6 to 8, which is smaller than a traditional group, but that also gives each person more space to participate. So we see research suggest that smaller groups are better. We also want to make sure that the groups are doing what they're supposed to, which is to help develop as a full functioning person. And that includes their physical domain, their cognitive domain, and their socio-emotional domain. So you want to make sure that it helps the full person. Now, I'll give you an example where we've seen a lot of research. When working with children on the autism spectrum, if a child is not in a mainstream setting or classroom, it's not uncommon for them to have a 6-to-1 ratio. That's 6 kids to 1 teacher, right? Or an 8-to-1 ratio. And you might ask yourself, well, why not the 25 kids that are in a standard classroom? Well, it's the same principle. Smaller groups results in more individualized attention, and that results in better outcomes. So that's important. Now, group settings or group therapy in school settings, better yet, tend to be brief, highly structured, whether it be through a psychoeducational or cognitive behavioral orientation. They tend to be very problem and solution focused. So you might remember earlier in this semester, I talked about solution focused brief therapy, right? The group itself tends to be more homogeneous. So the more similarity helps the therapeutic alliance, especially if you're going to have a few sessions. So there's The shorter the duration of the group, the more important it is to have a homogeneous membership. I already said that the orientations tend to be CBT or psychoeducational. Now, when it comes to dealing with more severe mental illness or severe problems, that usually is not going to happen in a group therapy setting for schools. It's not the setting for that. It's not uncommon if you have severe and persistent mental illness that you're trying to address. So things like schizophrenia or whatnot, you're not going to do that in a school setting. You're going to refer them out to either an outpatient clinic or an inpatient hospital, depending on how regressed they are at that point. So understanding the level of care that you can provide is going to be important, right? Because school counselors, you're focusing on schoolwork, friendships, bullying, things like that. But severe mental illness, you're not going to be able to do in a school setting. So you need to know when it's time to refer out or when it's time to refer to a higher level of care. And when I say a higher level of care, it's because that individual needs more attention or the issue is more severe than you can provide an intervention for in a school setting. So referrals, like I said, can be an outpatient clinic for weekly therapy. It could be an inpatient hospitalization in the cases of schizophrenia or suicidal intent and plan. It could be a social services agency if there's some issue related to their home life. So you need to know when to do a referral, and you need to make it part of your practice to have a list of referral resources for each of these domains. I have, for my independent practice, a community mental health agency in all 5 boroughs. I have a recommended psychiatrist for all 5 boroughs. I have inpatient hospitals that I recommend to in all 5 boroughs. I have social services contact for all 5 boroughs that I have just in case I need to refer out. So when you're building your practice, however you're doing it, you need to have these resource sheets to make sure that if they need higher level of care, you do that. All right. So developing the proposal, you want to make sure that your goals and purposes are expressed clearly. Now here's the deal. This proposal is oftentimes in a school setting going to be reviewed by the principal and or the assistant principal, as well as the guidance counselor. And I know I'm going to say this later, but you want to make sure you have the blessing of the administration for whatever proposal you're going to do. Because if something goes down, if something goes wrong, and you didn't show them your proposal, then you're leaving yourself on the hook. So make sure that the proposal is written well, the goal and the purposes are clearly explained. Make sure that you get the blessing of the administration. Make sure that the rationale, the need for the group is clear. Make sure how the children are going to benefit or the adolescents are going to benefit from participating is clear. And as with all groups, you want to make sure your targeted interventions, procedures, and evaluations are clearly listed. Now, I've said this before, very little of this is new except for the fact that you want to get the blessing of other people. And this is a good example why you would write a proposal, not just for my class, but in agency work and school-based settings you're gonna need another person's approval. So you also want to demonstrate that whatever stated gains they're gonna get are accomplished. So you want to make sure that you can assess your outcomes using the evaluation and your documentation is on point. So as with all other groups, you have collective goals and individualized goals. If we were to think about today's session that we did, we have an overarching goal of the session was to address various aspects of stress and allow you to pick where you wanted to go. And we picked school-based stress to focus on, but notice how even though collectively we're all focused on school-based stress, each of you were assigned unique homework. You're gonna come back next week and report what you did and the effect it had on your mood. And if we were writing a session note, we would chart that next week for your personal file. Now, just to give you an idea, my memory isn't perfect, so I took notes, right? I took notes, very brief notes, as to what you said and how it fit into the group. So when you work towards your individual goals, we need to be able to document progress. You also need to develop an attendance policy. Similar to other groups, it's important, but here, because this is happening in a school setting, you might be pulling a person out of another class in order to run this group. It's not uncommon for this to happen. The period that's most common to pull someone out is their lunch period, or if they had a free period, that one, so that it doesn't interfere with their academic curriculum. But what happens if someone has a test and they can't come? You want to develop a student-friendly attendance policy. You also want to address when a person just doesn't show up, right? They're in school, there's nothing wrong, but they don't show up. How do you handle that? And then you also want to provide an orientation for the parents. Because you're working with minors, you need to have both the consent of the parent, and depending on the age, if you're working with preteens and teenagers, you also need the approval of the child to participate in the group. Both parties have to sign. But you want to provide an orientation to the parents for several reasons. One is so that they know what you want to accomplish, what their child is expected to get out of it. But you also want to reinforce, even before they sign the consent form, that just because they signed their child up doesn't mean they have access to what their child said. And that's going to be very important to tell parents because, hey, what Johnny and I speak about, you don't have access to. It's protected information. But I'm their parent. I understand. But in order for them to feel safe, they can't have to worry. They shouldn't have to worry about me sharing with you. Otherwise, maybe they won't be honest about, let's say, their issues that they have with you as a parent. Are they going to bring that forward if I have to report back to you? All right. So you want to know your state laws with regard to working with minors. What I'm talking to you is New York State law. The laws differ from state to state in terms of who signs the consent form, who doesn't, who has access to the information. You definitely want to make sure that. Now, you want to emphasize confidentiality, but there are limits to confidentiality. So you don't want to tell them that everything they say is going to be confidential, because that's not true. In theory, if the school bills the insurance, then the fact that you went to that session, the fact that there is some diagnosis, the insurance company needs to know that. So you can't keep billing related matters confidential. You can't keep Court orders confidential. If the judge orders you to appear and talk about something, you have to appear. Kids need to know this. Teenagers need to know this. If there is any form of abuse, neglect, or maltreatment, you're a mandated reporter. Kids need to know that if there's suspected abuse, neglect, or maltreatment, you have to report that to social services. So that's important, right? And abuse comes in three forms: physical, emotional, sexual. Neglect comes in a form of school-based neglect. Let's say the parent's not making sure the kid goes to school and the kid is just staying home and not going to school for a month on. Well, you have to report that. If you're getting high with your parents, that's reportable. And you get the idea. So kids need to know abuse, neglect, maltreatment. You're a mandated reporter, so you have to report that. If they're suicide or homicide, you have to breach confidentiality. As it relates to suicidal, I have to care about you even when you think nobody cares about you. I have to love you even when you feel you're unlovable, right? So if you're suicidal, I have to protect you. If you're homicidal, then you're bound by Tarasoff, and each state has their own guidelines with Tarasoff law, the ethics, right? But if someone is suicidal or homicidal, you breach confidentiality. You have to report that both to authorities and if there is a specified target, the target, so that they can protect themselves from harm. Now, so I've listed these things, and you would tell the child these things, and you want to explain to them what is confidential, what's not confidential, because I've listed everything. And if it's not any of those things, it remains confidential. Now, you need to get permission from the parent and the child. You need to communicate what your expectation is of those in your group. You want to emphasize confidentiality to the extent. So if you're dealing with a teenager, let's say that the teenager is engaging in risky drug use. Do I report that? Let's say they're buying cocaine. Well, that's illegal, right? But you do not work for law enforcement, right? As long as the parent isn't getting high with the child, then that's not reportable. That stays confidential the same way if you're working with an adult and they were part of, I don't know, the mafia, or they're engaging in tax fraud. You wouldn't share that with anyone. You don't have a responsibility to snitch on them, so to speak. Only if there's an imminent harm to the person themselves or another person. So you want to make sure that they know that they can talk about activities that they're doing that might not be legal, and there's a safety there. And it doesn't go back to the parents, even though they signed the consent forms. Now, we want to think about practical considerations like the size of the group, which we talked about, shrinking it down a little bit. We want to talk about the setting. Some of the limitations of things happening in school is that these are going to be their peers, the same way you're each other's peers at the university. People are learning about one another. So you want to think about how to manage that. You want to remain neutral as much as possible. Do not judge. Use exercises and techniques that will open people up and talk, but remain open-minded and flexible, right? So that's very, very important. And you would be surprised, but people develop strong attachments to you. Even though the group might go for 15 or 16 sessions, they're going to miss the group when the group is over. So you want to prepare people for termination. So if it's a 12-week group, maybe you want to start preparing week 9 or 10. If it's a 15-week group, maybe you'll start week 12, or a 16-week group, maybe week 12, but you're spacing it out so people can adjust with the process of saying goodbye to one another. Now, play therapy. Play therapy is an incredible technique when working with children and adolescents. It's received tremendous popularity. I know when I talked about various theoretical models, I mentioned play therapy and Jacob Moreno and the concept of psychodrama. The nice thing about play therapy is it gives you an opportunity to discuss things in the natural language of the child in a non-threatening way. So I remember with one person I did like a family model where I had figurines of each member of the family. And I asked him to like lay out the members' experience. And they had, themselves, their mom and their siblings here on one side, and then their dad over here. And what we did was we processed, well, dad was facing the other way and very distant. And we were able to see, well, that's how this man saw his father, very distant from the family, disconnected from the family. And then you pay attention to, hey, I noticed that you're very close to mom and your sibling is on the outside. Tell me about that, right? So you can use figurines to understand family dynamics. You could use art therapy, right? So drawing. When you're doing trauma work with children and adolescents, drawing is a nice way to get people to express themselves in a indirect way where you can process that. You can use sand tray therapy or art therapy. All of these things are incredibly useful. Now, if you want a book that's changed the way I view therapy, there is a book called Dibs, In Search of Self, D-I-B-S, In Search of Self. And I don't want, actually, you know what? I don't want to overtell this story because when you read it, you're going to go in one direction. And by the end of the book, it opens your mind in a different way. But long story short is this a kid who's largely nonverbal, and the parents think that he has some intellectual deficiency or disability. So they take him to therapy, and he's nonverbal and whatnot, and the therapist works with him and cracks the code. So beyond that, I'll encourage you to get the book. I won't ruin it for you. All right. So we talked about different things of play therapy, whether it be drawing, sand tray, figurines, puppet theater, quilting for trauma is good. Now, your group play therapy in the school should focus on interpersonal issues, how to relate with one another in the school, or issues that either are getting in the way of academic performance or things, skills to teach that help with academic performance. But play therapy can work with interpersonal stuff. And it also is valuable to create safety signals for the child. Now, shifting to adolescence. When we think of adolescence, that's from puberty until when you leave the home at early adulthood. So the time frame is anywhere between 11 or 12, roughly, all the way to about 25, right? So that's adolescence. And if we were to think about Erik Erikson says that during adolescence, this is a time period where we're trying to figure out who you are. You're trying to figure out your value system, what's important to you. You're trying to figure out what you want to do, right? What you want to do at the next step. You're trying to figure out relationships, both friendship relationships and romantic relationships. You're trying to figure out who you're attracted to and, how to express your love. You're trying to develop a clique or a friend group. right? All of these things are important. So you tend to have a lot of stress on you in adolescence and emerging adulthood. So you're just trying to figure everything out. Now, very, very common is that there's strong emotional reactions in adolescence. And very common, there's a lot of tension both at home and in school. So if we go to G.S. Hall and Margaret Mead, which were two theorists, they had a debate whether adolescence is a period of calmness or a period of conflict. And what we find is that both of these theorists took the extremes, and it's somewhere in the middle. So Margaret Mead said that teenagers experience, it's the most peaceful time of their life is adolescence. And we know that's not entirely true. And G.S. Hall said it's a period of storm and stress. And we know that he overstated the level of conflict. So we do have conflict, but not at the level of G.S. Hall's argument. All right, so we want to work on family-based conflict and friend-based conflict as part of the process. Very, very common. Now, one thing that's interesting in adolescence is there is a shift from a focus of the parents having the most authority to your peers having the most influence over you. So there is this shift that happens where seeking approval from your peers matters. You're going to seek their approval more than anything. All right. Now, if you have a group experience that's positive, you're going to discover who you are, what your core values are, what your beliefs are, how you navigate relationships, and how you make decisions. All of these things could happen. Now, we know that in addition to figuring out who you are, we also know that adolescence is a time period where there is this naivete, and I don't mean this in a bad way, but it's almost like you believe the world is either perfect or should be perfect. And due to the idea of seeing imperfections in the world, you become advocates, right? A lot of social justice experiences emerge from teenagers. For example, March for Our Lives, right? So when we think about March for Our Lives, that is a national movement, but in New York, they were tired of the gun violence. So they did protests, they did rallies, and they met with legislators. And, gun violence is a problem. I think if you turn the news on this week, you would see it, but it's also a problem in the schools. So whether you look at Columbine or Newtown, Connecticut, or Stoneman Douglas in Florida, we have decades after decades of kids shooting other kids, kids killing other kids. And when I say kids, you don't actually have to be a child, but you could be in this adolescent stage. So it's a problem, and because of that, March for Our Lives New York did a whole host of meetings, and they got a law passed called the Emergency Risk Protection Order. And this is a law that is similar to any order of protection, that if a person is at a risk, they have to create distance. There's a stay away plan. But for this, the Emergency Risk Protection Order is about staying away from guns. So a teacher, school counselor, principal can report a person as being a public safety threat, and you can get an order of protection where you remove their guns for a temporary period of time from the household. Now, some of you may not have guns in your household, but if you have guns in your household and a child is talking about shooting up a school, well, then we have to protect the public, and that law got passed. Now, with all orders of protection, they're temporary. So you're not taking away a person's guns forever. You have a certain period of time before the judge where it's a temporary order, and then after the judge rules, there's a certain amount of time that the order is in effect, and it has to be renewed. So in order to maintain the person not to have their guns. So I know that some people are like, oh, that's an infringement on the Second Amendment, but it's a temporary issue due to severe psychological distress that you want to make sure that the person doesn't do something regrettable for themselves or other people. But that comes out of advocating, right? And that is one of the strengths of adolescence. So finding your voice is another characteristic. All right, so when you're leading adolescent groups, you want to make sure that you're clear in your guidelines. You want to make sure that the rules of conduct are clear. You want to make sure that the people who are in your group respect you and accept you. A whole host of techniques can work, such as music, art, drama, humor. All of these things are important. You also want to deal with the biggest issue, which is trust and limits to self-disclosure. So with adolescents, you can oftentimes either overshare and put yourself in vulnerability of being bullied, or you might undershare because you don't trust. So finding that sweet spot is going to be important. And you want to deal with any inauthenticity in the group. Now, cultural sensitivity is going to be very important. You want to demonstrate respect and understanding of people's value system. You want to make sure you understand why a person says what they do. And trying to understand an adolescent does not mean you become one of them. So you don't have to behave in a way that's not dignified to gain their respect. Now, adolescents are going to challenge you. They're going to challenge you more than most groups. In fact, other than a prison population, adolescents are probably going to push you the most. So they're going to test you as a group leader, and they want to know that you're not going to model all the people who hurt them in the world, right? So you're an authority figure, so they're going to challenge authority, but you need to embrace that in a non-judgmental and a non-defensive way, and that's going to help you function better. All right. Now, learning the language that people speak is going to be important. And here's an example where kind of like I didn't get it. So, all right. So I remember I was working with a 12-year-old male who had significant issues in his home life and school. And I don't remember what he said, but he said to, because of my reaction, he's like, you're tight. And now, generational gap, I said, thank you. And me saying thank you to him confused the hell out of him. Why am I saying thank you that he referred to me as tight? Well, in the 90s, when we wanted to give a compliment, we would say, oh, those shoes are tight, right? That would be a compliment. But it's used differently today as I got you angry, or you're angry, you're bothered. But I didn't know that. So learning how to speak the language in a way that is received is important. So anyway, I must have been defensive at that point, but I also, it helped us bond learning. Now, in a school setting, you're going to deal with issues of metal detectors. You're going to deal with peace officers and law enforcement. to reduce the likelihood of aggression and violence. But here's the deal. You can have as many metal detectors as you want. You can have as many peace officers as you want, but that's not going to solve the problem. And in fact, you may hear this language referred to, speaking of other legislation we're working on in New York State, is to address what's referred to as the school to prison pipeline. Some of you may know what this is, some of you may not know what this is. But the school to prison pipeline suggests that how we discipline minority youth actually puts minority youth at greater risk for incarceration. So when we suspend or expel teenagers from school, or we are overly punitive, we run the risk of them finding another outlet for their time. They're more likely to come through it, more likely to engage in criminal activities. So we are working on a law in New York State, as part of New York State Psychological Association, to change how schools deliver discipline. And it's called the Equitable Discipline Law that we're working on, to change it to a more compassionate approach, to a more supportive approach, rather than a punitive approach, because there are way too many minority youth and 20s, 20 to 30 individuals in jail cells. And so whatever, we want to change it. So metal detectors and law enforcement presence does not solve the problem. So let's find a way to do that. So doing groups to help people deal with anger management and conflict resolution is going to be much better at addressing the problem. So anger management, conflict resolution, you can run, either one of these can be a group. So everybody gets angry. I've been angry before. I'm sure everybody in this class has been angry. But it's what you do with the hurt you feel. I know I sound like Mr. Rogers right now. It's what you do with the anger you feel that matters. Because anger does not have to turn into aggression. Conflict brings intimacy, but conflict does not have to fuel violence. So in groups targeting anger and conflict, you want to help people develop interpersonal skills to talk things out, to engage in problem-solving behavior, to engage in self-talk, because sometimes you might be dealing with another person who's equally dysregulated, but they have reckless abandon. So you might have to talk yourself down not to do something that's regrettable. So teaching these skills could be useful. So shifting towards college counseling centers is another school-based setting. Again, it's time limited, many times lasting only up to 16 weeks. And you might be like, well, why 16 weeks? Because most semesters are about 15 to 16 weeks. They tend to focus on educational development, tend to deal with school mastery and passing one's classes. And I know you know we have a counseling center. We ran these groups for people. We also could have career planning groups. What's ironic is that I'm talking to you about this, and sure enough, these were some themes we discussed in our group, such as stress about what comes next. I think Brenda said that, right? So career planning and the anxiety that comes with school and stress management and grief groups, all of these are important. Now, it's interesting, by the time you're in college, you probably have dealt with a loss. If it's a grandparent, that's the most common. If it's a parent, that's also somewhat common. So you can run grief groups to help deal with grief and loss. COVID has created a whole host of grief groups on university levels, cultural identity groups. So, St. Francis College and the CUNY system, they're really, really good because there's tremendous diversity. So helping us appreciate individual differences and celebrate those differences are important. Non-traditional age groups. So St. Francis College also, we have first generation college students and there's no expiration date on education. So we have a larger number of non-traditional age students. So what if you're an older student and you're around a bunch of people 18 to 22, you might feel out of place. So having a group to help non-traditional college students cope could be useful. And as always, self-esteem groups, right? That's tremendous in middle school, high school, and college. These are very common. All right, now what are the key points? So if you're gonna design a group in a school, make sure you get administrator support. I think I've said this before. Do not go rogue because you're leaving yourself at risk. If your administrator doesn't support your group, don't run it, no matter how well-intentioned it is. You want to communicate with students and children about the importance of keeping confidence. Now, if you're in the same class with someone and people share very vulnerable aspects of their life, you don't want people going around talking about that. You want to keep the privacy. So what happens in group stays in group, and you want to say it in a way that they understand, right? And you might even talk, especially because there's a level of egocentrism at this age. You want to talk about, you wouldn't want someone talking about you, right? So we want to keep everything private or confidential. Now, don't just throw every kid who has a learning problem, self-esteem issues, being bullying into a group. Not every child is ready for group participation. And even if they are ready for the group, they may not share as much. Involve parents in the group work with the children. That isn't to say you share with the parents what they say in the group, but if there are exercises that are meant to be done between groups, you might link the parents in to ensure that they get done. And then role playing is quite useful, especially when it comes to peer pressure and whatnot. And that, my friends, is today's lesson. Any questions on that? Okay. One thing I didn't say in the lesson is also you want to make sure that kids don't feel like you're talking down to them. And I'm using the word kids, which in of itself might be a bias. But if you're working with children and adolescents, you don't want to be like, oh, what do you know? You're just a teenager or things like that. You want to make sure that you don't engage in ageism. I know that when you think of ageism, you might think middle adulthood or late adulthood, but there is a form of ageism called adultism, where you believe that if you're not an adult, you know nothing. You're meant to be seen and not heard. But children, adolescents, they have ideas, they have wisdom, and it's your job to celebrate their wisdom and not negate their experience. So with that, I'm gonna stop. Does anyone have any questions before we conclude today's session?
Discover La Roche-Posay Anthelios Fluid Lightweight Sunscreen by La Roche-Posay.
Hi, my name is Dr. Daniel Kaplan, and my mission is to make psychology accessible to all. In today's video, we are going to be talking about common cognitive distortions. Cognitive distortions are ways that your mind can trick you into believing something that's not actually true. And this is something we all do. However, in therapy, identifying cognitive distortions is one of the hallmark characteristics of cognitive behavioral therapy. And the cognitive distortions that we're going to mention today, I want to credit 3 people with their contributions. First is Dr. David Burns, Dr. Aaron Beck, and finally, Dr. Albert Ellis. These 3 individuals have helped us with a roadmap to identifying cognitive distortions. But without further ado, let's get into it. The first cognitive distortion that we will talk about is something called all or nothing thinking. You might even hear it referred to as black and white thinking. This distortion doesn't allow us to see shades of gray. It doesn't allow us to see what's happening in the middle. So we tend to think in extremes. A person might say that they're either fantastic or awful. They're either perfect or a total failure. And that dichotomy is unhelpful because usually you're setting yourself up for criticism and failure because no one can be entirely perfect. And if you use all or nothing or black and white thinking, that's going to leave you dissatisfied with yourself. Now, another example of a cognitive error is something which we call overgeneralization. So an overgeneralization is when you take a singular event and make it the rule. So on the right, you have a gentleman driving a bus, and they're driving, they get a green light, green light, green light, green light, and then they get one red light. And an overgeneralization would be if a person said, story of my life. So automatically that one event is being cast over everything the person experiences. So we have to be careful to scale back to reality, right? So another example is if you don't complete one task, you feel that because you didn't complete that one task, you're gonna be unsuccessful on all tasks. Another example is a mental filter. And this occurs in several ways, but the most common way we do this is that we pay attention to only certain evidence. Usually we focus on our failures and we disregard our successes, right? So that is what a mental filter is. The other example I give is if you have a romantic partner who focuses on one negative comment made by their partner, and as a function of that, they ignore all of the other positive comments, praise, experience that they have. This isn't going to be helpful, right? Because internalizing only the negative will block the positive. Now, the other example is disqualifying or discounting the positive. And what we tend to do in this case is if something positive happens, we say, yeah, but. Anytime you hear, yeah, but, that person is discounting or disqualifying the positive. So they're acknowledging it, but they're saying it doesn't fully count. So that would be discounting the positive. So an example of that is, let's say a person receives a positive review or feedback at work. They might reject the belief that they're competent because they might say, oh, well, that person's just easy on everybody. Their review doesn't count. Now, other things that are problematic is something called mind reading. Mind reading refers to when we assume that we know what someone else is thinking. Oftentimes when we do this, we're incorrect. And the best way to challenge mind reading is to do something called a checkout. I understood you to say or believe ... Did I get you correct? Now, but we make a lot of mistakes when we try and read another person's mind. And as a function of that, if we don't verify how we interpreted those events or their belief, then that could lead to things like depression, anxiety, social phobias, things of that nature. Another one of these examples is fortune telling. Fortune telling is when we think that we could predict the future, even though we don't have enough evidence. So if we take our experience now and project it all the way into the future, that's fortune telling. A good example of this is, let's say you have a person who is struggling in dating, and for whatever reason, they were in a relationship and it doesn't work out. They take that experience and they say, see, I'm not destined to find love, or I'll never find love or have a happy relationship. Saying that it's never going to happen in the future is fortune telling. Catastrophizing. This individual, they tend to expect the worst. And you see put Stuart Little, save your lives, the sky is falling, run, run, run. So catastrophizing is always expecting the worst or exaggerating the difficulties you're in. And this is a similar process to magnification. So what is magnification and minimization? So magnification is when you amplify or blow out of proportion the importance of something. Minimization is when you ignore or lower the value of important aspects. So typically, magnification happens in therapy where a person's magnifying the negative or magnifying their undesirable traits, whereas minimization, they tend to discount their desirable qualities. So you could see this is very similar to the mental filter and discounting the positive, because what you're doing is you're selectively choosing information that's self-critical or harmful to you while ignoring the rest. Emotional reasoning. Emotional reasoning is to think that just because you feel something, it must be true, right? So I feel it, therefore it must be true. No, it's important to understand that our feelings are real, our feelings are valid, but our interpretation or the narratives we write around our feelings are not always accurate. So on the right, a person may say, I feel left out. And that's the emotion, like feeling alienated or left out. So they interpret that as, see, this must mean that I'm not good enough, or everyone hates me, or I should just stay home from now on. All of these kind of narratives, that's emotional reasoning. When a person may just have been left out due to circumstance. Now, Albert Ellis, he's known for telling people don't shit on themselves or masturbate, right? So these are just ways that people use words to judge themselves. And usually, well, I guess it could be judge themselves or other people. When they say should or must or ought to, anytime you have these kind of language, it's an expectation. And that expectation, it's possible that it's not going to be met. And it comes with negative judgment and criticism, whether it be towards oneself or other people. Now, on the right, there is an artist who did a lot of these cognitive distortions on a picture, and I like this one. And she noted that if people use the word should or must towards themselves, it usually results in guilt, anger, and resentment. Whereas if it's use towards other people, it's you have bitterness, anger, judgment, etc. So labeling and mislabeling. We tend to label as a way of categorizing or understanding our world around us. But it is possible that we are assigning labels to ourselves or other people that are inaccurate or harmful, right? So if you label a person, oh, he's a whiner, or she's a phony, or even labeling yourself, I'm just useless, right? Things like that. These are extreme forms of overgeneralization. And, they're easy to pick apart because they're in absolute. Well, does that person always whine? So how is he a whiner? You think this person is never authentic? You think that you're useless in all ways? These are ways that we ask questions to challenge labeling. Personalization. Personalization is to turn inward our experience and think it's all about us, right? So if something bad happens, it's due to us, or if there's some kind of criticism, we say, well, it's due to something I either said or did. So we turn inward, and we tend to blame ourselves for absolutely everything that goes wrong in our life. And this is described by Burns as the mother of all guilt. In all situations, a person isn't 100% to blame for what's going on. There are circumstances outside of their control, but to personalize it is harmful. Now, the opposite, instead of turning inward, is to turn outward, where we blame. So it's his fault, her fault, their fault, but not my fault, right? So an example of blaming or pointing the finger at other people is, you made me feel bad. And that's a cognitive error, because we're not taking responsibility for how we interpret what was said, and we're not taking responsibility for our feelings, our emotions. So turning it outward, it's not helpful, right? Now, this is pretty cool. Fallacies of control. So there are two kinds of fallacies of control. A person may feel helpless, right, where they believe that they have absolutely no control, or they believe that they have 100% control over an outcome. But whether it's you have no control or complete control, that's damaging, right? Because we rarely have 100% control over our situation. So now, fairness. Expecting a just world, expecting fairness is a fallacy. The world is full of injustice. The world is full of unfairness, but people will cause themselves significant emotional distress expecting fairness, expecting the world to balance itself out and be just. And that's going to leave you angry, resentful, and having a negative attitude towards everything you face if you maintain the fallacy of fairness. Fallacy of change. This one is common, especially in relationships, where we think that if we say the right thing, or we encourage the right way, or if we criticize someone, they're going to change. And in therapy, we try and highlight that this is a fallacy. The only person you have control over changing is yourself. When it comes to changing other people, it doesn't work, because either they're going to change and resent you for forcing them to change, or they're not going to change and you're going to be resentful that they didn't. So on the right, I took the screen capture of, don't try and change people, just love them. love is what actually changes us, right? So the more you try and force change, it's not going to help. All right. Now, always being right, nobody is 100% correct all the time, right? So it's to believe that we are always right is a problem. And it causes a lot of conflict because people will go to great lengths to prove that they're right, even at the expense of other people's feelings or even at the expense of a relationship. So we have to be very careful not to believe that we're always correct or always right.
Are you ready for a taste of Wisconsin?
So heaven's reward fallacy, this is the belief that if we suffer, if we do the hard work, we're going to somehow be rewarded. So on the right, you see the scales. According to the sacrifice, that means you're owed something. The reality is similar to fairness. No one said you're going to get back what you put in. No one said that you're going to be rewarded according to your struggles or suffering. The expectation of fairness and reward is going to result in disappointment. So it's not always the case that we reap what we sow. And those are some of the more common cognitive errors. I hope this is useful to you, whether you're thinking about this from outside of the treatment room and you're like, well, hey, I was wondering how sometimes I may make the wrong decisions or jump to the wrong conclusions. This cognitive distortion list, it's a good starting point for you. Now, if you're in the therapy room, I recommend keeping track of all your distortions and working with your therapist to challenge some of these. So if you liked the video, if you found it useful, give me a big thumbs up, click the like button, subscribe, click the notifications tabs. This is one of the ways that YouTube determines the usefulness of the video and shares it with a larger audience. As I mentioned, my mission is to make psychology more accessible, and in doing so, you help me with that. If there was a specific cognitive distortion that you relate to and you want to start a conversation, put it in the comment section below. I read and respond to all of the comments, and I look forward to hearing from you. But until next time, take care, everybody. All right, so as a continuation from the previous lecture, we're kind of stuck in the middle of William James, and we talked a little bit about his life and his general contributions, but now I'd like to talk about the concept of pragmatism and his theory of emotions, and we'll progress from there. So can everybody see my slideshow?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Perfect. All right. So what is pragmatism? Pragmatism is basically, if it works, use it. That's my way of saying it. And ultimately, from a textbook concept, it's the validity of an idea depends on the outcome. So, as I said, if it works, use it. This idea was not exclusively William James, right? C.S. Peirce introduces this idea or advances this idea. We see this idea also in Wundt and Fechner's work. And the thing that William James does is that he turns it into a philosophical movement, not just an idea. All right, yeah. Now, the other thing we want to talk about is the concept of emotions. And if you've taken a cognitive psychology course or the psychology of emotions course, you're probably familiar with the James-Lange theory, right? Now, it's not the only theory out there. There's the Cannon-Bard theory, there's the Schachter theory, there's a bunch of other theories out there. But let's start with before William James. Before William James, the belief was that you have an emotional reaction and then you do something physical. So you get scared and then you run. That was before William James. But William James says it's the opposite. Actually, you have some physical response, right? And then you interpret that as an emotion. So in the case of if you see an alligator or a dog, you run first and then you're like, oh my God, that was scary. Right after the fact, you encode that as fear. So according to William James and Carl Lang, they believe that your emotional reaction is directly tied to some kind of physical or bodily change. So if there's no bodily change, then there's no emotion. So if there was no strong behavioral reaction or physical reaction, then you might not have had a fear response to an alligator or a dog. That's the mindset. Again, the Cannon-Bard theory is the opposite, right? Okay. So what are habits, right? So according to William James, habits are linked to the nervous system. They are a physiological response, and ultimately, by repeating an action, it increases the plasticity of that brain area or matter. And the more you repeat this, the easier it becomes, and less conscious energy you have to put into it. Now, what is your take? What do you think about this understanding of habits as kind of being linked to somehow neuroplasticity? Anyone have a thought? No hands. Okay. All right. Well, let me add to it. Neuroplasticity is your brain's ability to adapt or adjust. We know that the brain can adapt or adjust throughout the lifespan, but we also know that there's a sensitive period for neuroplasticity, and your brain is more flexible or able to adapt to experience at younger ages. So this idea of a habit being repeated exposure, and then it creates some kind of neural network or neuroplasticity, there would be questions about the extent to which this is true across the lifespan. So that's the thing that I would add to it. But, learning, there's something called LTP, long-term potentiation. Learning is still a black box in some senses for psychology. We're not exactly sure how all of these processes work. So it very well could be that William James is correct. We just don't have enough data to support it because, again, habits are learned, right? And becomes almost automatic. So if that's the case, we need to see how learning takes place. And there is something called LTP, which is a neurological process where certain neurons are reinforced, and learning takes place. Now, let's talk about, some of the major female pioneers in early psychology as well. And I'm talking about them because, number one, the person I'm about to speak about was William James's student, right? So Mary Whiton Calkins learned under William James, and William James was quite the mentor for her. And the concept of paired associate or association tests, that technique came from Mary Whitney Calkins, right? Or at least it was developed. We might say that Galton played a role as well. But he mentored her, he helped her through her doctoral program. He helped her deal with prejudice and discrimination. What we will see is that there was this belief that somehow women are inferior to men. That was a pretty prevailing belief. I know I talked about this in certainly lecture 1, and I talked about this in terms of Wundt and Titchener, how Titchener kind of pushed back against some of this. But there was this undercurrent about, like, really women struggled to find their place in psychology early on. But she did make a mark on the field. She made a mark, as I said, by her paired association technique, but she was also the first female president of the American Psychological Association. And I encourage you to take a look at the roster of presidents of the American Psychological Association. And what you will see is that in the early stages, the number of females that were presidents of the American Psychological Association were very limited, very few. But in more recent years, the vast majority of presidents have been female. So there has been a shift away from this, discrimination or sexism that was very prominent in her day. Now, in terms of 1906, so the early 1900s, she was considered 12th among the most important psychologists of the day. So it's clear that she was a powerhouse, a rock star, a genius, but just wasn't given the credit she deserved. Now, what's interesting is that William James was at Harvard, remember? And she was not allowed to formally enroll in Harvard. And because Harvard felt that they had a sister school that was an all-women's program that she should be given to, or she should go to. And so she didn't formally enroll in Harvard, but she did go to James's classes, and he advocated that she be granted a doctoral degree from Harvard. And in terms of her doctoral examination, she showed herself to be better than most of her peers. James himself labels her as absolutely brilliant, but Harvard says no. Harvard says, no, we have a sister school, and that's how it should be. Now, so she moves on. She doesn't accept the degree from Radcliffe, which is Harvard's sister school. And so she, for a long time, was without her doctoral degree, even though she earned it. She did all the coursework, she did all the examinations and whatnot. So she refused it because she felt that the only reason why she wasn't given a degree from Harvard, even though that's where she took all of her coursework, was because she was female. And she tried to plead repeatedly, and Harvard denied that. But ultimately, she would get a doctoral degree, an honorary degree from Columbia University. So many of you are approaching graduation. You will see that the keynote speaker oftentimes is granted an honorary doctorate degree based on their contributions. It's oftentimes a doctorate in letters, just some kind of acknowledgement of their life experience. So Harvard didn't give her that degree. They tried to give her one from Radcliffe, but ultimately she does get an honorary degree from Columbia. Okay, so what does this tell? This gives you what women were up against in the, well into the 20th century. Ruth Bader Ginsburg is probably the pioneer that pushes a lot of the gender inequality, away or advocates against it. But people like Calkins had to deal with this belief that women were somehow second-class citizens or inferior, or they didn't really belong in universities. So what's interesting is that if Calkins was born earlier, she wouldn't have even been able to attend William James's class, because until the 1830s, women weren't allowed in higher education. So, like I said, there was this male superiority myth that somehow males were intellectually superior to females. And that's why, as I said, if you look at the early history of psychology, it was dominated by men. But now it's not the case. So if you were to look at the psychology major, the vast majority of psychology majors at the undergraduate are female. And remember how Calkins wasn't granted her doctoral degree from the institution she was at? If you look across the nation, the percentage of doctoral degrees that are granted to women it's over 70% at this point. So 70% of all new psychology doctorates are granted to females. So clearly, the belief that women were somehow inferior has not really withstood the test of time. Women have demonstrated that given the opportunity, they could excel to the same degree and oftentimes higher than men in the craft. So I thought that was very important to talk about. So where does this male superiority myth come from? It actually derives from Darwin, and I would argue that it also was propagated by Freud. So it was leading male figures, but Darwin's argument was based on a variability hypothesis. And what he found was that if you put males and females on a bell curve, the bell curve is wider for males. Now, he goes and looks at one side of the bell curve and says at the higher end of the bell curve, males are outperforming females. What he didn't talk about, which is important, is that the other side of the bell curve on the extreme low end of the spectrum, males also perform lower than females on average. So when it comes to things like an intellectual disability, males have higher rates of intellectual disabilities, Down syndrome, and a whole host of these other conditions that would affect intelligence. So he cherry-picked one side of the graph to argue male superiority, whereas females, their bell curve was less extreme, it was more to the middle. So the scores tended to be more closely clustered together. So based on this belief of these bell curves, Darwin felt that women were not going to achieve intellectually the same way that men would. And Darwin felt that males had further evolved brains relative to females, and in some way, exposure to education would be damaging. And if you go back, I keep bringing up Ruth Bader Ginsburg because it was really at that time when things started to change. It takes another 70 years for things to really change in a meaningful way. And one of the arguments that Ruth Bader Ginsburg said is that the laws that were in place that were related to gender discrimination, the people who wanted to keep the laws argued that they were somehow protecting women. And this was for women's benefit. And she said, what are you protecting them against? You're protecting them against advancement in the discipline. you're protecting them from overtime and opportunity. So this idea that you're protecting, you're really not protecting women at all. You're just not giving them the same opportunities. So this idea was pervasive, you know, in the 1800s, early 1900s, all the way until, you know, the 1960s and 70s when things start to change. The saddest part about this is that we had data in the early 1900s that suggested that this was all nonsense. Darwin's idea about the male superiority myth, it's just not true. Freud's idea, not true. We had the data. And, you know, Woolley and Hollingsworth would just prove it. So here's another example. So Helen Bradford Thompson Woolley, right? So she winds up, you know, in the institution, goes to the University of Chicago, and she's mentored by Dewey and Angel, which were big professors at the Chicago School or the University of Chicago. And ultimately, she showed promise, and she finished up her undergrad in 1897, got her doctoral degree by 1900. So it only took her 3-year PhD. But what's nice about her is she at least had support. When we think of Karen Hornung, she fought for the opportunity to get education, and her parents didn't support her. Which was very different than Woolley's experience. Woolley actually had the experience of support from her family, which is good because that's one less battle she had to fight. She eventually gets married to Paul Woolley, hence the last name Woolley, and she follows him as a physician to the Philippines and starts to do some research on child labor. And what she found was that 8-year-old children were working 10-hour days, 6 days a week, and there were not really child labor laws at that time, which when you think about it, you know, that was the place, that concept was in place, especially in the South, because of a lot of the agriculture that was down there. But even in northern states, we had some of this. So if you look at the states, there weren't many child labor laws. So she starts pushing this, and she really starts to study child development. Eventually becomes part of the child welfare research. If you've ever heard the term Child Study Center, these kind of phrases harken back to Woolley. She created one of the earliest clinics to study childhood learning and education and whatnot. So she was one of the early pioneers. But in addition to her studying of children and establishing a clinic for children, she was the first to objectively measure whether this concept of male superiority had any merit. So she administered a whole host of things like motor tests, sensory tests, intelligence, and personality. And what she found was that there were no differences in emotional functioning. So the argument that somehow going to school would affect their emotional well-being, well, if it's not affecting men, it wouldn't affect women because there was no real difference in emotional functioning. And when it came to intellectual functioning, even when you say that some of the scores were higher for males relative to females, that wasn't statistically significant. And if we're going to use a science, we must use statistical testing. And the differences were so small that we couldn't argue that males had significantly higher intelligence than females. Moreover, what we did see is that there were cluster areas that women tended to perform better at in her testing, such as memory and sensory perception. So she said, well, how do we explain any of these differences? Well, she argues that it's due to the social environment, right? And if society is not cultivating the minds of women, they're of course they're going to perform poorer than men. But all things considered, their overall intelligence, there are no real differences. And then she wrote, another book called The Mental Traits of Sex. And when she's talking about sex, she's talking about biological sex. And in this text, she argues that males or male psychologists engage in some form of a femininity bias, right? So there's a lot going on there. So at this point, there's no real reason to believe that women are somehow inferior to men, right? There's enough data to disprove it. But it still took, like I said, another 70 years, roughly, from the early 1900s to the 1970s to get some meaningful change. All right. So the data was there. Now, Letta Stetter Hollingworth, she actually married Harry Hollingworth, which was also a psychologist. And that's important because, she was just as great as him, but she wasn't given the credit he was given. All right, so 1906, she graduates from the University of Nebraska, and it given the distinction of Phi Beta Kappa. Now, in order to be Phi Beta Kappa, you have to be in the top 10% of the university. So the fact that she was Phi Beta Kappa means that her performance at the university was greater than at least 90% of the student body. So once again, another gifted individual. And she starts teaching, and she's teaching high school, and for 2 years, like I said, she gets married, and then ultimately her husband is teaching at Barnard College in New York, and she discovered a problem when moving to New York, that New York State refused to allow women to teach in public schools. So here she was teaching. She comes to New York with her husband, who's now teaching at the college, Barnard College, and she can't teach. She's not allowed to teach. Why? Again, this implicit bias against women. And, it's interesting. We would like to believe that this bias it had to have been somewhere other than New York, right? New York is one of the more progressive states in the nation. But in reality, New York has not always been so progressive, and there were laws against women even teaching. All right. So what she starts to do is she starts to write, and it doesn't really earn her much publicity. It doesn't really take off. So she and her husband decide, okay, well, why don't you get a doctoral degree? So they agree to this purpose, and she starts saving money, and he starts saving money, and she starts going to Columbia University. Now, in the early 1900s, Columbia University was the premier destination for educational psychology, or the application of psychology to the classroom. In fact, does anyone know what Columbia University is also referred to as? If you were to get a doctoral degree from Columbia University, the program would be housed in the Teachers College, right? So it's a carryover from the early 1900s, because that's where a lot of the breakthroughs in terms of child development, in terms of education, all of this is happening there. Now, what's interesting is she gets her PhD in 1916, but she studied under Thorndike. And Thorndike had his name on a building at Columbia University because Thorndike was viewed as one of the preeminent psychologists of the 1900s. But in more recent years, they had to remove his name from the building at Columbia University. And the reasoning was that they discovered the extent to which he was racist, sexist, and anti-Semitic. They found it in his writings. They found it he worked alongside the chancellor of the college, or I don't know if it's chancellor, president of the college at that time. He worked alongside to find a way to exclude Jews from campus. So all of this comes to a head, and it's like, wow. But what I find interesting about this is studying under Thorndike, he has these implicit sexist biases, but he still mentored her. She got her degree, and that may not have been an easy mentor for her to have if he's harboring such a bias. So eventually she gets her PhD and becomes a civil service psychologist for New York City. And she does research to further explore this variability hypothesis that Darwin said, right? So what she found was that she collected data on sensory motor intellectual functioning across the board, wide range of subjects for what we would call participants. And her data, once again, refutes the idea that the variability hypothesis was true. So this data rejects Darwin's idea. And it also challenges the belief of female inferiority. Now, one of the examples of females' inferiority was that their mood would change as a function of the menstrual cycle. And she found that that's not true. As a whole, the menstrual cycle did not really impact emotional functioning. Now, there is a small group of people who might be diagnosed with, and now the DSM-5, PMDD, premenstrual dysphoric disorder. So it's not that nobody is affected in their mood and their concentration and all of these things, but the vast majority of women are not. So the idea of the menstrual cycle is going to affect either your cognitive abilities or your emotional abilities. It's not true. So her data slams this. Again, look at the time. Now this data is in 1916, and it takes, once again, almost 50 plus years, or a little over 50 years, for us to get meaningful change. So the data was there. So I don't, again, looking back, we call it a hindsight bias. I don't understand how people could believe that, but people did, right? And I don't understand how people maintain that belief set when there was so much data disproving. Ultimately, she becomes recognized as one of the most influential researchers, and she's cited in the American Men of Science for her work and contributions to the psychology of women, right? Interesting name for the organization as well. She also challenged the idea that women are inherently nurturing and had this motherhood instinct. So she felt that, fulfillment, the motherhood, I should define what it is. Motherhood instinct suggests that people feel more fulfilled when they're taking care of their children, or women feel more fulfilled taking care of their children. And she said, yeah, no, that's not true. Women can get enjoyment from activities that are unrelated to their marriage and family. So tying women to the house and to their husbands and children is not true. Women can find enjoyment elsewhere. All right. So her premise, her punchline is that it's society and cultural attitudes that keep women back. And very strong feminist, she argues against women not being included in any discipline. She feels that women could, the sky's the limit. Do not restrict your potential, and women should be allowed in every single discipline. So we talked about her work, her research. We talked about her research on gender differences, but she really was a big proponent of creativity and giftedness. So when we talk about intelligence, many times people focus on deficits, and she demonstrated that there are gifted children, and the way they think and how they express creativity might be slightly different. Now, she had her own discrimination. All of her research that she did, she never received a research grant, which means that she never received external funding for her work. So she had to do it on her own. She had to figure it out without those means. And as I said, she was very strong in terms of women's rights, the suffrage movement. Again, the suffrage is the right to vote. So she was part of the group that advocated for women having the right to vote. So when you think about this, you have to acknowledge that women had a very hard time in this discipline for a very long time. And they adapted. And found ways to make their mark. And that is a sense of pragmatism, right? So if we were to think about the term or the movement of functionalism, we have to give Titchener credit, because Titchener wanted to distinguish his model from the concept of functional or functionalism. So he writes in 1898 postulates of structural psychology. So Titchener is saying clearly, this is the model of psychology I'm going to focus on. And he went out of his way to say structure was important and should be separated from function. So the fact that people argued against it and developed this functional spirit is ironic, because he was trying to suggest that structuralism was the only thing we should be studying. Okay, so we mentioned Dewey and we mentioned Angell, right? So when we talk about the Chicago School, they were central to our understanding of functionalism. So let's talk about a little bit of what they do. So John Dewey writes a book called Psychology. How original, right? By the way, most textbooks, that's the most common title. And you're like, well, wait a minute. If the title's used, why can someone else use it? Because the book is different and no one has a trademark on the word psychology. So he writes a book in 1886 called Psychology. And this book becomes so influential that it leapfrogs Principles of Psychology by William James. And that's a big point, right? So because, as I said, William James, if you read his work, it's elegant and he covers so many areas of the discipline, but John Dewey's work eventually leapfrogs it. So he starts his career and creates a laboratory, eventually winds up at Columbia University as well. Again, notice Columbia University is a hotbed In 1904, he starts to link psychology with education and philosophical problems. He writes a manuscript called The Reflex Arc Concept of Psychology. Now, what is the reflex arc? You may remember we kind of touched on it with Descartes, right? So a sensory stimulus goes up to a certain point, and then it comes back out the other side, almost like a rainbow as a motor output, right? So it's an arch or an arc. Dewey said that's not true. He actually said it's a circle. And that's important because if it's a circle, then, you know, your motor response could elicit in another sensory input. And our perception influences our motor response. So it's the idea of a sensory input going up to the brain and then having a motor output, he felt was incomplete. And then in terms of functionalism, how he fits in with functionalism, he argues explicitly against Titchener. He feels that we cannot study mental elements. Breaking down consciousness to its smallest parts is useless. And that was what we call the Lexington and Concord of functionalism. Now, Lexington and Concord, does anyone know that reference? The first shots of the Revolutionary War. So it's the first shot of functionalism. All right, so any kind of breaking things down to mental elements is useless because when you strip things down to their elementary parts, it removes the meaning of that conscious experience. So he rejects that, and he said we should study the whole organism as it functions in its environment. Now, what's interesting is that he acknowledges that the organism, the person themselves as a whole, is the unit we should be studying, right? And he felt that our consciousness serves a purpose, and the purpose of our consciousness is to help promote survival. So a real big shift, right? A shift, study the whole person, don't break a person down into their elements, and consciousness is not just a building block idea, it serves a purpose, which is for survival. All right. So James Roland Angel, right? He turned it into a school of thought, right? Again, he also becomes very influential at the University of Chicago, gets a lot of notoriety there, and University of Chicago gets some fame there. Ultimately, he does his own work, right? And he studies under Dewey, right? And he reads, William James's work. And then he goes to work with William James in his lab for about a year. What's interesting about Angel is that he did not receive a PhD, or he didn't write his PhD and get one that way, but he did receive several honorary degrees, total of 23 of them, right? So while he didn't get one through his own studies, other people recognized his contributions and gave him the honorary degrees like I've talked about. He winds up at Yale, becomes the president of Yale, and creates the Institute for Human Relations. All right. He writes his own book called Psychology. Once again, an original title, right? And what he says, what's the purpose of consciousness? Again, focusing on function, not structure. So he writes that the purpose of consciousness or its function is to help us adapt. So it improves our adaptive qualities, promotes survival. And psychology should focus on studying how the mind helps us adapt to our environment. Now that's very interesting because this sounds very much like early cognitive psychology. And when the behaviorists come in, they are going to hate this. The idea of studying how the mind or mental processes help us in adapting or evolving to our environment, they don't like that because it's not as measurable. And you're going to see John Watson says that psychology should only study behavior because it's concrete and measurable. So they're going to hate this idea entirely. Now, in 1906, he writes The Province of Functional Psychology, and he argues that structural psychology is basically useless. And that's how functional psychology or functionalism gets its own stature. So what do we see? Now, what is interesting is from the very beginning of psychology, there has been dissent. If we were to look at Wundt, he had to contend with the phenomenologists, and they argued with him. If we look at Titchener had to deal with the functional psychologists, right, or functionalism. So he had to deal with William James's argument and Angel's argument and Dewey's argument. And so there's never been one school of thought that has been adopted as the exclusive truth. And if you go back to our first lecture, I said that psychology is in a pre-paradigmatic stage. Francesca, what did I mean that psychology is in a pre-paradigmatic stage?
I'm not really sure, Professor, but I did hear you. I just really don't know because I don't want to give you the wrong answer.
It's okay. By the way, it's okay to be wrong too, right? It's a learning community, right? Jenny, what is the pre-paradigmatic stage?
Was it like how psychology was in between the stage of being a new science but an old science at the same time?
And that's the paradox of psychology, is that it's both the oldest and newest. Thomas Kuhn talks about psychology as being in the pre-paradigmatic stage. What is a paradigm? A paradigm is a universally accepted set of principles by whatever discipline it is. And Thomas Kuhn said psychology has never been in the paradigmatic stage. It remains in the pre-paradigmatic stage, which means that there are competing schools of thought. There are competing positions as to what psychology is and what it should study, right? So Wundt wanted to study consciousness, right? And building up consciousness. Titchener wanted to break down consciousness. The phenomenologist said, no, you can't build up, break down, because when you break it down, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So do not break it down altogether. Then you have William James talking about the adaptive value of psychology and trying to study the adaptive value. And then you have the functionalist school that we're emphasizing now. Now, I thought I saw a hand up, maybe it disappeared. Laura, did you have your hand up?
Oh, as you were saying it, I was remembering what it was, and then you said school of thought, and I was like, oops, too late.
Sorry. Absolutely. Forget the typo. That should say psychology with an H, P-S-Y-C-H. But yeah, there's never been one point in the discipline of psychology that we've held a universally accepted belief set as to what psychology is and what what is important to study. We have these subdisciplines. And even when you get your doctoral degree, because I know many of you are going to go on to graduate school, you are going to have to pick a specialty area. Clinical psychology, counseling psychology, school psychology, and industrial organizational psychology, all of these different schools of thought. Now, some are more compatible than others. And then even if you choose clinical counseling or school psychology, you're going to be trained as either a behaviorist or cognitive behaviorist from a psychodynamic lens, from an existential lens. So you're trained with a very small prism. And we've never agreed on one whole concept, which is wild, right? So now you're starting to see what Thomas Kuhn meant by we're in a pre-paradigmatic stage, a state of conflict and disagreement as to what psychology is and what the focus of psychology should be. Okay, so what are the three themes of functional psychology? The first one is it is the psychology of mental operations. Now, mental operations, you might think of this as cognition, right? So how a mental process operates, so that's cognitive psychology. What it accomplishes, right? And under what conditions does it occur? So that's all mental operations. We also argue that this is the study or the psychology of the utility of consciousness. Now, utility means usefulness or purpose, right? So there has to be some benefit or function of consciousness as a whole, right? And the argument that functional psychologists suggest is that consciousness mediates the needs of the person or organism. I guess it could be an animal as an organism as well, and their environment. So consciousness is kind of like the buffer between the organism and their environment. And then functionalism would focus on psychological relations, right? So they try and study the total relationship of the organism to the environment, so the whole person. So similar to Gestalt psychology, we don't want to break things down into their parts. Study the whole organism and their environment, and we don't need to make a distinction between the mind and the body. Now, it dawned on me that when I was talking about William James, I never talked about his stream of consciousness. And the stream of consciousness is a flow of experience and ideas. And it is ever changing and never, like there's never 2 points in time that it's the same. So anyone watch Pocahontas? And there's a song, Just Around the River Bend, right? And in that song, they say something to the effect that you can never step in the same river twice. I think something like that. Well, that actually comes from William James. And the concept of stream of consciousness, it's ever flowing, ever changing. So instead of trying to break down consciousness the way Wundt and Titchener wanted to do, you should study the whole experience of consciousness, which you could see why William James falls into this functionalist school of thought. All right, so Harvey Carr. So Harvey Carr starts off as a math major at the University of Colorado and switches to psychology and discovers that there's no good research program at the University of Chicago. So he winds up moving to the Chicago School, the University of Chicago. He learns under Angel, which is a major player, as you just saw, in the functional spirit. And Angel teaches Carr experimental psychology. Eventually, he becomes a research assistant under John Watson. Now, John Watson is a behaviorist. So that's interesting because he gets trained under Angel, which has this cognitive spin. He also gets trained under John Watson. And Watson has a purely behavioral spin. But did you lose me?
It looked like you left.
For some reason, I don't know why it shut the application, but it didn't close us out, which is good. But how much did you hear?
You were out for maybe like 45 seconds.
So I'm gonna redo this slide because I don't want you to lose any of it, right? So ultimately, Carr gets his degree at the University of Chicago, or the Chicago School, as it's referred to. And Chicago School becomes the premier place for functionalism as a subdiscipline. And I keep telling this story because I want you to know the names Dewey, Angel, and Carr, because these are the three major players as it relates to functionalism in the Chicago School. And ultimately, under Carr, this becomes the premier focus of psychology, or American psychology. So I mentioned that he studied under Watson, worked in his lab, eventually takes over Watson's position at the University of Chicago. And I'll tell you this story, why Watson left there, and there's a whole to-do about that. And then, he's there and at the Chicago School, and eventually becomes a chairperson after Angel in 1919. And for the next 20 years, he serves as the chairperson. And under his tenure, he grants 150 degrees. So that number is pretty remarkable, and it tells a story about the growth of psychology as well. 150 doctoral degrees in his 20 years at the program. That's showing that, the field is growing. Now, functionalism establishes its final perspective in 1925, and here is our final statement of what functionalism is. Functionalism focuses on mental processes, mental activities, things like memory, perception, feeling, imagination, judgment, and will. And I said that this is interesting that he studied or worked with John Watson, because the functionalists put a lot of emphasis on cognition, and Watson was a radical behaviorist who didn't want anything to do with it, right? So there's this kind of duality going on at this point in history. All right, so how does the mind work, or how does it function? It functions for two purposes: to try and acquire, retain, or organize experience. So that is one of our cognitive processes, and to use these experiences to help us determine what we should do in the future. By this point, functionalism is mainstream. It is at the top. Now, John Watson, you're going to see, even before 1925, wrote a manuscript called psychology from a behaviorist viewpoint. And he disagrees with Freud in studying the unconscious. He disagrees with Wundt and Titchener in terms of building consciousness up or breaking it down. And he disagrees with the functionalists in terms of cognitive functioning. So there's a lot going on here. Okay, so functionalists as a whole, they allow data to come from multiple sources, whether it be introspection, whether it be from experimentation, and so forth. All right. The most important thing is objectivity, right? Objectivity is rather no subjective interpretation, basically. So as long as it's an objective data point, it was fine. It didn't matter whether it was a human model or an animal model. And that's, when we go back to the word organism, that should have clued you in that it could be a human or an animal that they studied. So ultimately, what does the Chicago School do is they bring us from the subjective interpretation that we had with Titchener to a more objective study of behavior, right, and cognitive psychology. Okay, so now we move to Columbia University. Columbia University, like the Chicago School, there are several institutions you should know of before I go into this. Harvard University is an important institution for the history of psychology. Columbia University is an important institution. The Chicago School is an important institution. Not that these are the only ones, but you're going to see a lot of major players coming through these three institutions. All right. So in addition to the Chicago School, Columbia University also adopts this functional psychology spirit under Robert Sessions Woodworth, and it becomes a major, major, major home for people like Cattell, who studied memory, and Thorndike, which we talked about as, having to have his name taken off the building of Columbia for studying the law of effect and animal learning. So Robert Sessions Woodworth, right? Technically, he would not have wanted to be considered a functionalist as a whole, because he was a Renaissance man, similar to people like Helmholtz. He had a lot of interests that weren't just functional in nature, but nevertheless, his work comes out to be similar to this functional spirit. So what was Woodworth's life? What did it look like? Well, he learned under Granville Stanley Hall, or G.S. Hall. He read the work of William James, and Hall and James are the leading thinkers in the early 1900s as it relates to psychology, right? So eventually he gets his PhD at Columbia and starts teaching physiology. So he studies under Sherrington. Does anyone know who Sherrington was? Sherrington was influential in neuroscience. And he demonstrates that there must be a synapse. So he proves through his studies on animals, or dogs in particular, that the speed of an impulse is not a constant. And why is it that within a single neuron, the speed of an impulse is at one speed, and when we measure communication through multiple neurons, it slows down? So one of his arguments was it must be that there's some something happening between the neurons. And that's what we view today as the synapse. Now, becomes very influential. He teaches at Columbia University, well, twice, but first from 1903 to 1945, comes back, and then retires again in 1958. He teaches till 89 years old, and he was considered quite a charismatic professor, popular, and many people viewed him as their mentors and most influential figure in their career. So he writes a lot. He writes dynamic psychology. He writes a book called Psychology. If you're wondering a name for a book, again, Psychology. We can't trademark the word psychology. Many people have used this as the name of their textbook. And then he wrote his own textbook on experimental psychology. Keep in mind, this is still early in the discipline, so there weren't that many experimental psychology textbooks out there. So he writes experimental psychology, dynamics of behavior, and the Gold Medal Award. Now, he receives the first one. What is a Gold Medal Award from the American Psychological Association? It is different than the Wundt James Medal that I talked to you about. The Gold Medal Award is kind of a lifetime achievement award. So if you make sustained, meaningful contributions to the field of psychology for decades upon decades, you would become a candidate for the Gold Medal Award. This is not the kind of award you can nominate yourself for. It is an award that is peer nominated and voted on by your peers. So it is a lifetime achievement award. It's quite distinguished. Okay, so now, one of the important things that he gives us is understanding the relationship between stimuli and responses. If we were to talk about behaviorism, you might hear the term SR learning. You have a stimulus that happens from the environment, and then you have a behavioral output, right? But what Woodworth suggested is that the same stimulus does not always lead to the same response. As much as Skinner would like that to be true, as much as Watson would like that to be true, as much as Pavlov would have liked that to be true, a stimulus and a response are mediated by the organism. So you, the perceiving person, are going to influence the relationship between the stimulus and the response. And the same, as I said, the same stimulus does not always lead to the same response. I'll give you an example. Imagine you are an elite boxer and you are fighting and you're in a boxing match and someone punches you in the face. It is going to cause a pain reaction. However, that response to that stimulus is going to be very different than if you're walking down the street. You're not in a boxing match and someone randomly punches you in the face. The same punch is going to elicit different levels of pain depending on the context. So in a boxing match where you expect to be punched, you're actually going to report less pain. There's going to be more adrenaline. You're going to be prepared for the punch. So the pain is actually less than if you're walking down the street. Same stimulus, different response. So it's a good point that Woodworth made, is that we have to pay attention to the organism as the mediator between the stimulus and the response. Okay, so what should we study? Well, according to his perspective, we should study consciousness and behavior. Introspection is important in this model or approach to psychology because it allows us to know what's happening within the organism. Observation and experimentation are also necessary. So that's very, very interesting, right? So we are tapping into what you're experiencing on the inside, but we're also observing what you do on the outside, and we're also setting careful research studies to elicit a response and see what happens. So what is dynamic psychology if you were looking for a definition? Dynamic psychology tries to explain all the causal factors and motivations for both behavior and emotions, right? Behavior and emotions. So it's not just behavior, it's these cognitive processes. All right, his work builds upon some of the work of William James and some of the work of Dewey. As I said, he focuses on motivations, right? So he really wanted to develop the study of motivation or motivology. All right. So every single behavior has a physiological underpinning, and he wanted to study what's happening within a person as well to try and better understand why people do what they do. Now, you might say that this dynamic psychology that Robert Sessions Woodworth is slightly different than functional psychology, as I've stated about 10, 20 minutes ago. But he wasn't trying to argue with functionalism. He was trying to extend the reach of functionalism. So there's no contradiction there. All right, so, well, what is functionalism? If we pull back a little bit, is functionalism the activity, or is it the use of an activity or the usefulness of an activity? And the argument is that these two things are not the same. So Carr, again, one of the early pioneers in functionalism, says if you're defining it as the activity itself, right? So the activity of memory, the activity of motivation, things like that, that is not the same as the use or function or adaptive value of the activity. They're inconsistent. So he draws the attention to it. Now, Titchener, remember, Titchener said we should be studying the structure of the mind, and functionalism is not psychology, right? So all of this leads to applied psychology, or taking the core technical principles of psychology and blending it with the needs of the environment, or adapting it to the needs of the environment. So that's what applied research and applied psychology does. So we use the scientific rigor, we benefit from the theoretical or the pure research, and then we complement that with applying it to the needs of society. Okay, so what does functionalism do? One, it serves as an opposing force against structuralism. You may recall that I said structuralism tries to explain the question that starts with the word, quote, what? What is the mind made of? Whereas functionalism rejects that and says psychology should start with the question, why? Why is the mind made the way it is? Why do we do what we do? So this is a rejection or an opposition of structuralism. We also see that research is not just the, quote, normal human adult or a healthy adult. Research can include animals. It can include people with mental illness. And research goes beyond introspection. We have experimentation, we have direct observation. So functionalism broadens the lens of psychology quite a lot. And that is where we will stop. Now, before I stop the recording, I do want to set the stage. When functionalism takes hold of psychology, there's a lot happening in the world. And these world events are going to push psychology to come up with meaningful solutions to significant problems. And when I said applied psychology, that applied psychology includes taking the basic principles of learning and applying it to the school system for public education, taking the principles of psychology and applying it to the business world, taking the principles of psychology and applying it to the therapy world, taking the principles of psychology and applying it to the courtroom. And you will see that industrial organizational psychology, school and educational psychology, the testing movement, forensic psychology, and so forth. All of these sub-disciplines are an outgrowth of applied psychology. And if not for this functionalist spirit that says, hey, this must have a purpose, then there would be no applied psychology. Because psychology also must have a purpose. Because if psychology doesn't have a purpose, then why do it? Why get a degree in it, right? So we, as we will see in our next lesson, are going to talk about psychology's struggle for relevancy. And that is applied psychology. I know I said a lot, but I'm going to stop there. Questions?
This is just a matter of knowing what a sociogram is. You know what it is? Let me just show you. So it is, you know, whenever you see gram, it means it's going to be one of those, something I can look at, right? So like the eco map, the genogram, things like that. So sociogram, you would use maybe in a group session, but I've also seen them used in in a classroom setting. And what you're looking for is kind of the relationships between the people in the group. Like how many times they talk to each other, or how many times, when Bobby does this, Johnny does that. So that's a sociogram, okay? So it just kind of looks at, you know, these are men and women and kind of boys and girls. So you're just kind of looking at the interactions within the group. You got it, you got it. Not until about 2 weeks before well, actually for you, I do. I do, because you take it, yeah, and you're also, this is the best way to find out what you don't know, so yes. I like it, I think it's a little bit harder than probably the exam, but I like it, yeah. Yeah, yeah. I like test.com too, and you know, it's not like the real test, but I do like it because it's about content. Okay. What's wrong? Okay, you're not taking you're off you're on your period, or you're not? Okay, yeah, that's some hormones. Your body hasn't had hormones. It's a girl thing too. How you like that stuff? Okay. Okay. So a savvy one would do it during the meeting. You wouldn't even notice, right? You'd be used to it. You'd just do it afterwards. Okay. So let's rule out though. So we know it's a graphic representation. So a graphic representation of the goals, of the group's ultimate goals, no. A graphic representation of what was accomplished in a given session. So that may be it. Or D, identifies the nature of the therapist's interaction with the rest of the group. So I know it's not D. So then it should be down to A or C. So let's go back to the question. And it often is constructive for a group leader to construct a sociogram after each meeting. So what is it? The alliance is in the group. Okay. So he's doing it after each meeting. It wouldn't be just one given session. Okay. Exactly. So when you go back to the question, that's what I said. So after each meeting. So it's not just one given session, right? After each meeting. So that's where we're going back to the question. Always go back to the question because the answers are in the question. Okay. So this one. Okay, so these are all of Yalom's techniques, okay? So which is the one that we use in a psychodrama setting? So psychodrama means you're acting out, right? Okay, so cohesion is the tightness. Catharsis is that emotional release. That's the scream, all those things. It just kind of, let that release. So that's the only one where you're actually doing something, and it's a psychodrama. So I'm acting something out. Okay, so cohesion you can do, and universality that's a feeling, right? We're all in the group. Altruism, that word means we're doing what's best for the entire. I'm giving out. I'm giving back. It's not just about me, but I'm doing it's something that the goal is that I'm not getting anything out of it. I'm doing it the best for somebody else. Okay. Sorry. share your own reaction. It's a group